1949, and the Cold War is getting underway. Troops trained to defend Western Europe, and the United States joins its allies to set up NATO. In China, the communists achieve their greatest victory as Mao Zedong becomes leader of a quarter of the world's population. British troops reinforce Hong Kong, and the frigate HMS Amethyst makes a daring escape from communist forces. In London, the year opens cold, with the city still gripped by post-war austerity. Smog shrouds the streets, and although there's a hint of better things to come when rationing is abolished, the country's stunned when the pound is devalued, sending basic food prices up. There's turmoil in the financial markets, and the government exhorts British firms to take advantage of devaluation by launching a massive export drive. One unlikely figure who listened to the government's exhortations was a 69-year-old widow, Olivia Durand Deacon. She'd been left wealthy by her husband, a colonel in the Gloucestershire Regiment, and had been living comfortably at the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington's elegant Queensgate for many years. Mrs. Durand Deacon had the idea to produce artificial fingernails from plastic and was looking for someone to help her exploit it. One of the hotel's other permanent guests seemed just the man, a dapper and friendly 39-year-old businessman named John Haigh. Always cheerful and well-dressed, Haigh drove a smart Elvis motorcar. He told people at the hotel he was the owner of a prosperous small factory in Crawley, about 50 miles south of London. When Mrs. Durand Deacon approached John Haigh about her idea, he was extremely interested. He told the entrepreneurial widow that he would look into the type of material needed for the fingernails and find out if the necessary equipment could be accommodated at his factory. Haigh consulted his diary, and they agreed to go there on the 18th of February to discuss the project. Haigh arranged to meet Mrs. Durand Deacon outside the Army and Navy department store and drive her to Crawley in his Albus. He later claimed she failed to turn up. Nevertheless, Haigh drove to Crawley that day. He'd been a regular visitor for several years and was known in the town. At about 4 in the afternoon, he was seen at the George Hotel in the centre of the town, having tea with a lady of very similar appearance to Mrs. Durand Deacon. 2.5 hours later, he popped into a nearby cafe, Ye Old Ancient Priors, for egg on toast and a chat with Mr. Outram, the proprietor. Later, at around 9:30 in the evening, he went back to the George for dinner. After enjoying a hearty meal, he drove back to London. The next morning, Mrs. Durand Deacon was not at her usual table for breakfast. Expressing surprise, John Haigh asked another guest, Mrs. Constance Lane, who was rather less enamoured with him than some, if she'd seen Mrs. Durand Deacon. To his consternation, she knew all about their appointment, and he hastily explained that Mrs. Durand Deacon had failed to meet him as arranged. Later that day, Haigh again drove down to Crawley. While there, he visited his premises and sold some jewellery for £110. He also left a Persian lamb coat for cleaning and called in at the George for a meal. As usual, he was quite open about his presence in the town. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lane had checked her friend's room and found it had not been slept in. When Haigh asked her next morning if she had any news, she announced that she was going to the police. This took Haigh aback, but he recovered sufficiently to offer to drive her to the station in his Albus. At first, the police didn't take the disappearance very seriously, but a sharp-eyed agency reporter phoned the story to an evening newspaper, and it was soon being widely reported, and a search was mounted by Scotland Yard. Haigh's first interview seemed unsuspicious as he explained that Mrs. Durand Deacon had failed to turn up for their rendezvous. Back at the hotel, he confirmed his story in a lengthy statement. But routinely following up his story of the trip to Crawley, police were surprised to discover that far from owning a factory there, he only did business and occasionally used a small storeroom. The police decided to question Haigh again. He was interviewed a third time by a policewoman, Sergeant Alexandra Lambourne, who took an instant dislike to the little man. He seemed too eager to please. Nonetheless, he repeated his story without any apparent inconsistencies. Back at the station, she wrote a report saying she felt uneasy about him, suggesting his background should be investigated. Haigh complained to the press about police harassment. However, it turned out that Sergeant Lambourne was right to be suspicious. Haigh had a long record as an accomplished conman and had in fact been in prison 3 times for fraud, forgery, theft and false pretences. With what appeared to be a promising lead, the local police at Crawley were asked to check Haigh's story again, and they went back to the head of the factory where Haigh had done business. It was then he suggested that they might like to look in the storeroom that Haigh used. On the 26th of February, 2 detectives accompanied him to the small yard where it stood. The yard still exists today, close to the centre of Crawley. The only set of keys had been lent to Haigh, so the detectives prized open the door. At first, the interior seemed quite ordinary, with various tools, tins, bottles and rags. And then more unusual items started to turn up. A pair of heavy rubber gloves and a rubber apron stained with chemicals. There were also a wartime gas mask, some empty acid containers and some corroded metal drums. When they found a revolver, the detectives knew they were onto something. This was confirmed when they found a number of personal possessions, including jewellery and a handbag containing a cleaning ticket. The next day it was discovered that this was for a Persian lamb coat that belonged to Mrs. Durand Deacon. Immediately, the police went back to Onslow Court Hotel and were waiting for Haigh when he drove up in his Albus. He was brought in for further questioning and seemed quite unconcerned, dozing off while waiting to be interviewed. When Detective Inspector Shelley Symes asked him where Mrs. Durand Deacon was, and when they revealed that the police had found her jewellery and coat, he only seemed to hesitate briefly. Then Haigh launched into an extraordinary story, admitting he had taken her belongings. The detectives warned him, but he went on. Mrs. Durand Deacon no longer exists. She's disappeared completely and no trace of her can ever be found again. I have destroyed her with acid. You will find the sludge that remains at Leopold Road. Every trace of her body is gone. With no trace of emotion, Haigh described how he had shot her and then put her body into a vat of acid to dissolve. As he spoke with pride of the way in which he had planned and carried out the murder, it became apparent that Haigh was confident that without the body, the police would never be able to convict him. Throughout all his interviews, Haigh was to show no remorse or concern for his victims. Appalled, detectives listened as he claimed to have cut her throat and drunk a glass of her blood before putting the body in the vat. He described how straight after shooting Mrs. Durand Deacon, he had gone to Ye Old Ancient Prior's restaurant for a poached egg on toast before starting the work of disposing of her body. The body had taken several days to decompose completely, and Haigh had emptied out a lot of the sludge into the yard with a bucket and refilled the tank at least once before the process was complete. On the 2nd of March, Haigh was taken to Horsham Magistrates Court and accused of Mrs. Durand Deacon's murder. Angry crowds attempted to attack him as he left after a 2-minute hearing. Haigh's confidence that the police would never find a trace of the widow's body was soon rudely shattered by the forensic skill of Dr. Keith Simpson. Starting inside the storeroom, Simpson found bloodstains which matched Mrs. Durand Deacon's blood group. Then he turned his attention to the weed-covered yard and found the spot where Haigh had emptied the sludge. Soon he picked out a stone about the size of a cherry. It was the first of 3 human gallstones. Covered in fat, these would have taken weeks to disappear completely. Vastly encouraged by this first evidence of a human body, Dr. Simpson and his team continued their meticulous search of the yard. The press followed every development as news of the remains began to emerge. Public interest was intense, and crowds flocked to peer into the little yard as detectives continued their work. Every inch of it was examined. Not all the reports which appeared in the press were strictly accurate. The search lasted for more than a week, and soon questions were being asked about the real total of this macabre killer. Everything in the storeroom was taken away, together with boxes of sludge-soaked earth and the corroded drums. The crucial discovery was a set of false teeth which had not decomposed. They belonged to Mrs. Durand Deacon. As the evidence against him piled up, the police were finding out more about Haigh's background.